everyone, my name is Kieran Kelly. I'm from Larian Studios, and we're going to be doing a special segment here at the Digital Tabletop Fest on Steam. And we're here at EGX because, for one very, very special reason, we're going to talk to a lot of our developers who've actually come to the event with me, and we're going to talk to them about what makes our game have that tabletop feel and how we apply tabletop rule sets like the D&D 5th edition onto our games and what that does. So we're going to take a short rest at our campsite, and we're going to talk to them right now. All right, so I'm actually here with Jason Latino, our cinematic director. And Jason, you've joined the team for BG3 specifically. Yep. I mean, you came along, I guess, about 3 years ago now?
Yep.
About that? And I suppose when we're talking about tabletop experiences specifically, we actually share a table every week, yes. Although most of it's been virtual over the last while. But, you know, we play D&D together very, very regularly, so we know each other quite clearly as to what we want from a tabletop experience. Yep. And when you started Baldur's Gate 3 and coming from the cinematic angle, I know that it was really important to you that you still got that tabletop feel that we've had from Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2. And how do we now bring that into a cinematic age? How do we bring cinematics and still give that tabletop feel?
I mean, it starts for us where we have like the bread and butter of the cinematic team on Baldur's Gate 3 are the interactive dialogues. So as you're navigating the world, as you're meeting NPCs and interacting with them and affecting and changing the story, you have skill checks. You have these cinematic moments, and just like we tend to approach those like a DM. So a DM will have the most control over the chaos of the party at the beginning and end of the session. How do you set the tone? How do you introduce a new space? And then how do you reinforce the choices that the player has made at the end, setting up and your little mini cliffhangers and all that kind of stuff. And we have that opportunity every time you click on an NPC or every time you're drugged into a cinematic. We make sure that we set that tone, that we control the timing and pacing, and let the player know what they're going to be interacting with early on, allowing that time to settle in.
Because we talked about this before, right? Yeah. With like, it's really tempting, I guess, with you, with all your technology and all the storytelling that you want to put out there. You don't want to take player agency away. Yeah. So there's always that line as a DM where I can describe a scene, but if I describe it too far, I suddenly tell you what you do and I take your agency away. And from a cinematic angle, you've got to be very delicate with that to make sure that the player never feels like they did something that's not quite what they wanted to do, right?
Those interactions in the middle of the scene where you're changing somebody's mind, where you're passing a skill check, where you're casting a spell, that sort of stuff, we kind of treat those like almost gameplay animations. They need to go by quickly. The player has pressed a button, they've selected a dialogue option to do a thing. We need to get on to the business of doing that thing as fast as possible. Just to make sure that we are again honoring that input in the same way that the gameplay animation team, like if you're casting a spell in combat, that needs to feel snappy. You need to feel like I pressed a button, something happened, and that's how we handle the cinematic storytelling as well.
You keep that as organic as possible. It makes it feel like it's my action and not something that you're just doing.
We don't want you to feel like you're directing the scene. We want you to feel like you're acting in the scene.
There you go. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing, the direction you've been taking for all of early access and what you'll be doing in the future in the full game. Just improving. And I guess another topic that I know that we've discussed heavily on, even especially with the CGIs that we've made, the cinematics there, and even some of the in-game cinematics that we've made for the tutorial levels and some of the early access levels, we've had plenty of discussions about, well, how do we make this, because we're not just dealing with our own system, we're working in D&D 5th edition, so you've got all these monster stat blocks that you've got to go look in, and while the 5e world is rich and Forgotten Realms is rich with lore and information and imagery, there's not a whole lot of moving imagery there. So a lot of the time you and your team are needing to interpret what the stat block actually means, right?
I mean, and that's the most fun that I'm having with adapting 5e and the Forgotten Realms setting. It's just like putting this stuff in motion for the first time. Like the art style of the books is really kind of defined and attracted people to this edition of D&D, and putting motion to that is something that we take very seriously. And I've been a player more than I've been a DM, So every once in a while I'll see, okay, well, there's mind flayers. I know a bit about mind flayers, but what do they actually do? What is mind flaying?
What does it actually mean when they go into my mind? Yeah.
Exactly. And it turns out it's very violent and gory. And so we look at these things and we look at what are the spells that these monsters are going to be casting in the game, what are the abilities that they're going to be using in combat, and what's not showing up in combat, and how can we put that in?
How do you visualize it, right? Because so much of it, we're not explicitly saying what they are, so you need to infer that visually, which is sometimes a lot trickier than it sounds.
Yep. I mean, when a mind flayer is wrapping its tentacles around your head and extracting that brain, that's something you're going to want to see in a close-up, and that's something that we take a great pleasure in putting into a close-up.
Yeah, there's a particular group of our team that are probably very, very interested in doing that type of animation, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we have a whole cinematic animation team.
That's our cinematics and our various things when we're trying to figure out what monsters do and whatnot. But to bring it back to DM, direction, tone, I know that when we're DMing and we're playing, because you DM for me sometimes and I've DM for you, there's such a delicate balance in getting the players to trust you as a lead, as someone who is leading the scene, so to speak, or the experience, but not trusting you so much that they can believe everything that you say.
Right.
And so I know that there's been a huge amount of work that's gone into the direction of not just our voice actors, but very specifically our narrator, which we very often ourselves call the DM, because in a lot of ways Amelia has become the DM of the game, right?
Yeah, so I mean that was something where like the using a narrator to help describe and deliver the story and the impact for the player is something that Larian has a lot of practice with. Figuring out how to adapt our approach to that for a cinematic game. We did a lot of work with Amelia and different takes, and what we kind of settled on was this DM take, something that has a little bit of that cat and mouse, has a little bit of that half smirk that makes you wonder how much do you trust the information that you're getting, because then it's not just when do I have dialogue choices that makes it a playable space. If I am interpreting the words that the narrator is using or the words that they're not using to describe something, that interpretation also becomes a part of the interactive space. And it's the same way that it is at the table, where you're trying to figure out, it's like, okay, this is an oddly specific piece of information. You're telling me that I'm 120 feet away from this object.
Not 125 specifically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what, like, are you just messing with me, or are you trying to get me to approach this differently than I would by default? And it's stuff like that.
There's a cat and mouse feel to it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
A little bit of that DM kind of sadistic mentality.
No, I'm very nice DM. It's fine. So with that, Amelia, but I know even when we were talking, like even before necessarily Amelia was cast, but when we cast her, we were so happy with her. But I remember you saying that part of it was it took a special type of talent from Amelia, because you don't want the actress, in this case, to overact it. It actually needed to be a little bit toned down. Yeah. It needed to be a bit more neutral to allow the interpretation there, right?
When you have this kind of third-person omniscient entity telling you a story, you end up going into the default take. The first one that anybody will give you will be a book on tape, like where it's Stephen Fry reading a Hitchhiker's Guide, and he's emoting all of these characters, and he's delivering the emotion because he is the source of truth. Whoever that narrator, whoever's that reader is the source of truth. We needed to put a little bit of doubt into that just to add depth to the narrative experience.
So to continue along with the CGIs that we've made, obviously there was a huge CGI for the opening of Early Access. Yep. Massive dragon fight with a nautiloid ship, which obviously we loved, over a city that we had to figure out which city do we want outside of Baldur's Gate. I know that the team involved were super excited even just to put dragons in and to animate dragons, but there's a lot of challenges to go with that too, right? Even from the tone of the actual the scales, like we had red scales, but they were showing up too dark, so we had to kind of tone that up. So what were some of the challenges even there?
Well, I mean, so like even just like, okay, you've got red dragons, but the hue, the redness of those dragons changes if they're young, or if they're old, or if they're ancient, or if they're adults, and all this sort of stuff. So making sure that we were just looking into that and paying that level of attention to the source material was really important.
It gets brighter as they get older, in case you're wondering.
And then just the physicality, representing these dragons. Like you start these projects with doing layout shots and nailing the timing and the storytelling and all that sort of stuff. And then you have like, okay, well, this dragon pops from here to being down here in the layout. What does that actually look like? How does that feel impactful? And you end up looking at the stat blocks for stuff like this, because you have dragons that need to feel large. In animation parlance, something that needs to feel heavy moves slower, but dragons are incredibly fast in the game, and so figuring out how you can communicate that size and that weight and still make them feel agile and dangerous and quick, and that they can turn on a dime is something that takes a lot of back and forth.
Yeah, and even I guess like I always think of that shot over Yartar, and then the ship just bamfs, right?
Yep.
And there's nuances in animation that you only appreciate when you see it a few times, and it's the bit where the ship disappears and they feel the ship disappear. Do you know that way? It's like there's so much nuance in that you just can't you can't throw it together. You know, that was a lot of work that went into it.
It was an incredible amount of work, and it was a lot of back and forth with some really amazing partners. And yeah, they were just as engaged by the material as we were, and bringing that world to life and thinking about, it's like, okay, you have this giant, massive nautiloid battleship that just disappears from one plane to reappear into another. What happens to the air that the dragons are actually traveling on, and what effect does that have for their kind of flight patterns? It's all in the detail.
Yeah, and as I guess if we are the DMs of Baldur's Gate 3. Yeah. There's a lot of attention to detail when it comes to the Forgotten Realms lore, and I know originally when we were making the trailer we were thinking it might have been that the Nautiloid was flying over Baldur's Gate, and then we were like, no, we're not going to do that, so we're going to make it a different city. And we actually had a conversation about, well, what city can we pick that's small but not too small, that's the right size with a river, and so like we eventually settled on Yartar, right?
Yeah, we settled on Yartar, and that was like us combing over all the maps and like looking at the different editions of the Forgotten Realms, and just like looking for a suitable space for the Mind Flayer ship to be essentially stopping and refueling. Like we joined that scene, in the middle of things, and you see those dead Mind Flayers in the hallway. And the pilot is essentially stopping off to gather more thralls to fuel whatever campaign, dark campaign they're waging. Yes, exactly. And just stopping and thinking about like where to go, like when it's being chased by these red dragons, chased by these Githyanki.
Yeah, because I remember that conversation so vividly, and it really made me appreciate how much. Not just you as a director, but like your whole team was we're not just going to make a city.
Yep.
It needs to feel like it's part of the world. It has to feel like it's legitimately part of this world. So everything from the heraldry on the tower literally has to feel like it's part of something in the world, right?
Exactly, and that's where, like, in the same way that D&D is this collaborative storytelling where DM and players are yes-anding each other's decisions. You would have a unit putting together the art direction for this tower, and they would put these banners. And then we're looking at this as like, okay, well, now we have to find a place. Now we have to make those banners meaningful and reflect the license. It's not just enough to have like, well, there's like lions on there or something like that. It's like, no, okay, what should be on here? Like, it can't just be some random imagery. It has to be set in this place.
It's a classic challenge that we find when we're making our games, that we do something which opens a can of worms, but the thing that we're doing is so good that we don't want to lose it, so we then have to fix all the worms that have spilled out, like the heraldry or whatever else that we find, right?
And for the people who are just dialed in and know that stuff, they enjoy it. And for everybody else, it just feels specific. They don't necessarily need to know what that banner is from, but the fact that it's there, they just absorb the setting.
Yeah, and if they ever do poke, they realize it's deeper than they realize, which is even better as it goes, yeah. Brilliant. Well, that's about it. So thanks very much, Jason, for talking to us. Really enjoying all the cinematics that you're putting into the game. I really appreciate that you're really coming at it from that tabletop experience, that you know what it's like as a player, you know what our players should feel like, and you're applying that to the way that we're directing the game.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure, and really the work of a lifetime.
Open your mind to me. Let us see what lurks within.
Nick, you've been with us since the end of, I think, DOS 1 Enhanced Edition, is that correct? So you've been working with us for that. Obviously, DOS 2 was a huge part of what you helped us with, and I know you were integral for the systems that we built there. And now you're working heavily on BG3. Is there anything else about your job description or your job that you want to explain to people before we get deep and diving into the tabletop experience that we're talking about today?
Sure, maybe just remind people that systems, different companies mean different things by that. At Larian, this means the RPG core, the math, the formulas behind the scenes, what characters have available, skills, spells, attribute stats, that kind of stuff.
So for DOS 2, that was also you working on making our classless system, and BG3 is you actually directly figuring out how we make a tabletop system into a video game. Is that correct?
Indeed, indeed. We read the player's handbook a lot, and we try to figure out how to make sure that it feels like
you have an
D&D.
excuse. I read the player's handbook a lot for other reasons. You do it for your job. Well, that spins us off really nicely though, because I really wanted to talk to you about. For me, tabletop experience is a lot about the class I play, or if I'm playing a different system outside of D&D, sometimes it's feat-based or it's classless. DOS 2, specifically, Divinity Original Sin 2, gave us that experience of a class. It felt like a class-based game, but it was completely open and classless. So how do you still manage to give me that feeling of archetypal play and interesting decisions to make as I level up, without making it just super flat like a feat-based system or something like that? Did you have to go deep into that, or is it hard to find the right identity for certain things, or how did you start it with that?
We, even though it is a classless system, we had archetypes, like you say, in mind. We had an archetype of sneaky assassin, the guy who summons a lot of stuff, the necromancer, the fighter that gets right into the face of enemies. All of these different archetypes, and we're trying to make sure that all of them are viable in some way, and also that players get little packages, little pre-made starts that will kind of illustrate the idea of a class to them. They're not classes, we call them presets, I think, in DOS 2.
Yeah,
but that's what you start with, yeah. It's a really tiny skill set that tries to illustrate how will a summoner feel in DOS 2. Like right from Act 1, first fight, you already understand, okay, this is how it will feel. Should I restart it? Should I get another one? You get the picture. Now, in Baldur's Gate 3, of course, it's now a class-based system, and we are working with class fantasy. So in many ways, it's a lot easier for us as well, because now players know what they're getting into.
Clear expectations.
Absolutely. When you start the game with a druid, you don't even need to read everything about the druid. You kind of understand the idea that they will be connected to nature, there will be some beast magic involved, they will probably have a bit of healing, and that's because you watched movies where druids were characters, you played other games, you read books, you read comics.
Some folklore or whatever, yeah, I get it.
Absolutely. Yeah, folklore as well. For druids specifically, that's a big part, right? And so this gives us, the designers, a bit of kind of room to make sure that, okay, we know that what the players are getting into. We don't need to explain that much. We can focus on achieving that fantasy of that class.
Yeah, there's enough implied information there that we can lean on, that we can actually just then focus on what makes that class unique. That's an interesting spin. I wasn't even going to ask. Was there a situation in BG3 or even DOS 2? Probably not so much in BG3 because it's such an established system in 5e, but in DOS 2, was there any sort of preconceived ideas that you were a little bit fearful of, or that we had to be careful of because someone might apply their thinking to something that wasn't the way we were going? Do you know what I mean?
I know what you mean. It's easy to imply that things are possible in the game when they aren't.
Yeah.
We try to think our classes through upfront and make sure that this doesn't happen. We don't ship something like this, because in a Larian game that would be a disaster. At the same time, we were completely okay with people breaking the game, right?
Yeah.
We knew about a lot of exploits that people later found out. We only, I think, patched the ones that literally broke the game. So, there was, I think, an infinite damage exploit based on a few different statuses coming together.
There was a loop one as well.
Stuff like that, yeah. And honestly, we would be okay with that looping, but it really destroyed performance, so that really didn't feel.
Yeah. But actually, I think that's an interesting thing, because we wouldn't have never said it before, maybe, but the idea that allowing them to kind of break the rules of the game, or at least abuse the rules of the game to achieve something amazing, is exactly what a DM would do. If the player comes up with a creative idea, they want to lean into that usually rather than leaning away, right? So by us doing that it literally is our life and soul in Larian, is to do that type of gameplay, right?
Exactly. We're really inspired by what DMs do at the table, right? We know that in tabletop gaming, a lot of design happens between the players and the DM. And there is kind of a negotiation. What will the DM let their players get away with? So, easiest example is for patch 6, we're adding these weapon actions to Baldur's Gate 3. That means when you're proficient with a weapon, you will have a set of up to 3 weapon actions that give you some tactical options in combat. And when creating these tactical options, we were thinking, what would the DM reasonably allow the players to do at the table? Would a DM allow them to kind of bash someone with a pommel of their sword? Or will the DM allow to kind of rush at the enemy with a spear? Things like that feel natural, and that will probably come up if you're playing in tabletop, and probably came up for a lot of players. So that was a real inspiration for us there.
Yeah, it's like when you're in that unique situation and you're like, well, if I use my pommel on my sword here instead of the blade, you look to your DM and say, can I do that? And they're like, well, let's roll for it and see. It's going to be more difficult, but maybe. This is us actually expanding the options to allow those creative solutions that players are going to come up to, which they would normally do at the tabletop, but they wouldn't be able to do if our rules were black and white, right?
Absolutely. What we see, it's actually extremely common when you start talking to people who play D&D to have some amount of homebrew in their experiences. Sometimes DM tweak minor rules, sometimes they introduce entire major mechanics, and they do it for all kinds of different reasons, because people play different different campaigns, different homebrew campaigns,
Even different groups
settings,
of people,
different groups of people as well. Yeah, so some people are not really into dungeon crawling experience, so we need to figure out how to make talking interesting.
Speaking of homebrew rules, we've recently, I think in one of our most recent patches, we introduced the new camp rules as well, which are obviously not necessarily locked in D&D rules, but we've tried to introduce them because of, there are some interesting challenges that come up with video games when we're trying to make a tabletop system into a video game, right?
Yeah. So at the end of the day, these are different mediums, right? You play tabletop experiences at a table, with snacks, with your friends, and a lot of the times campaigns take months, right? You play video games, computer games at your computer at a desk, you probably want to have achieved something meaningful within 30 minutes, right?
Yeah,
it's a very different pace. Yeah, we don't really have months to get there, and so the way D&D books pace exploration progress and pace the journey, the adventure, needed to be tweaked to make sense in the world of Baldur's Gate 3. So we came up with camp supplies, which kind of grounded the camping experience a little bit, made it feel like it's not just a button that you press, and also it gave us something to do with all of the food that we put everywhere, because we like to put food in the world because it feels more believable, because what do they eat, right?
Well, if you have a table there and there's food on it, you should be able to loot it, right? So if you loot it, then what am I doing with that food, right?
What do I do with the food? Great. Let's tie these two together. Let's make sense.
But I think it sits on a really important point that for us, the soul of the experience, the feeling of the experience is the most important thing. That if we are trying to emulate the tabletop, sometimes it's not actually going absolutely rigid on the rules, it's finding the flexibility within the lines to go, this is what the experience should be. So in a video game, how do we emulate that feeling, right? It's about the feeling rather than the specific black and white numbered exacts.
Yeah, it's about transplanting emotions, if I can say something silly like that, right? So maybe you want to tweak the rules to make sure that the emotions stay the same. And at the table, the DM is really the barometer of emotions. Like, a good DM, when they're looking at their party who's having a really hard time in combat, like, nobody will blame them for like tipping the scales in party's favor, because they want the adventure to continue, right? Like, it's an open secret. No DMs would ever admit that they do this.
Hey, this is dangerously close.
This is dangerous. I'm probably on blacklist in several communities by now, but we all know that we want stories where good guys win, or maybe if you're playing evil guys, then evil guys win. But it doesn't matter. Players want to create plans, they want to have an adventure, and they want to execute those plans, and those plans to succeed. They want to get to know the story till the end. They want to see everything unfold. And unfortunately, if you start putting in real chaos into the mix, well, you'll see real life happen, like inconclusive stories, storylines that go nowhere, combats that end in disaster. Sometimes it's fun, but if it happens every time,
It can get very disappointing.
it's very disappointing. And the problem is that when we have so many players playing the game with real randomness, there's going to be that 1% that will have an absolutely worst experience. Like, there's nothing stopping them from mathematically failing every single roll. Like, there's somewhere there's a player who had that experience,
This
right?
guy would literally know that exact bell curve, I'm sure.
It has to happen, right? Statistically, there has to be a person who failed every single roll that they attempted.
So you're talking about how a DM will color in the line sometimes, will tweak the health of an enemy sometimes, or maybe they plan on bringing 5 orcs to the party, but they're only bringing 4 because they're struggling with the first 2, this type of thing. We don't have that nuance because we're not live with the player at that time, so we have to adapt in different ways, which actually is a nice segue into another thing that I know we talked about recently was the randomness tweaks that we've added to our dice play, right? Because we've got dice play in combat, but also dice play in social activity. And you have specifically been working with tweaking a system to try and to clip that bell curve a little bit, right?
Yeah. First of all, disclaimer, completely, you can turn off all of those, completely optional. You can turn all of them off. If you feel like it, go for it. We support you. But this is something we added in one of the previous patches to try to smooth out, especially the early game combat experience. When we see characters are at the beginning of their class path, they don't have a lot of options. And if the options that they have, if they don't pan out, you feel like you tried everything you could, you made good plans, and it wasn't up to you that you failed, and then you feel like you're at the dead end of your journey.
The loss is not because of your own agency. If anything, it's out of your control.
That feels really, really unfair, and we wanted to make sure that this happened very, very rarely, at least statistically and significantly rarely. So that was why we tried to create stabilized RNG or weighted RNG, or fudge dice, how some people call it. I've heard a lot of different terms.
And to be fair, these are the types of things that are actually very nuanced, and it's a very delicate balance of doing it right or doing it wrong. And so that's why early access is actually the perfect space for us to explore these things, right? Which is exactly why you'd put it into early access, to make sure that we could test it enough.
Absolutely. If it would crash and burn, we would take it out. That's the thing that also mirrors tabletop. The way we can interplay with players, like we can hear what they think, and we can go like, okay, this was not a great idea. Stuff it.
As a DM, I might go, I think it's a really cool thing if we homebrew travel, and travel becomes super hardcore, and every hour you have to roll to see if you're going in the right direction.
And your party goes like, oh my god.
Or they might really love it, but you don't know until you try, and then next session you go, you know what, let's not do that. And that's literally us just testing it makes sense.
Misdirection.
Yeah, exactly, misdirection. Well, speaking of the party, and I know even we said earlier on that we've gone from being with the classless system of more kind of like individual focused. Now this is a class rigid system where it's party focused. And I know that from our perspective, we're also very multiplayer focused. We really like to make sure multiplayer is an integral part of our development and our design. And while you can absolutely play it single player and you'll have a great experience with single player, we allow for up to 4-player multiplayer, which adds a huge amount of complication to your job, I'm sure. So that's also part of what makes it a tabletop experience, though, right?
Absolutely. So tabletop experience is ultimately a social experience. It's really hard to play tabletop alone, play D&D by yourself. Usually it's a party, but then we really try to make sure that when people play in co-op, when they play a Larian RPG in co-op, it feels like they have individual freedom, the same way you would probably have it at the table. So that it's not just a linear experience that two people observe at the same time, like watching a movie together. It's more like you two acting together in the world and getting to know each other through these actions. You can get you can get to know someone by things like how they behave in combat, how they talk to NPCs, even how they sort their inventory. You can get to know a lot of new things about people that way.
Yeah, and I think like there's a lot of randomness that comes with that. But even like when you say you could do the individual thing, I know it's been a huge part of us as well. Is that when you're playing a multiplayer, you can spread out and you can go wherever you want. And so, famously, you could in DOS 2 and even now in BG3, I could be deep in the Underdark in complete terrible trouble because I got myself in a terrible fight that I really shouldn't be part of, and you could be still swimming it out with the druids in the Druid Grove, totally chilling and totally safe, right?
Absolutely, just browsing Trader and going like, what's happening? Are you okay?
And I know that sometimes it introduces some challenges because you might do part of a story that I wasn't part of, but that actually, for me, it increases the immersion level because it doesn't feel like the story hinges on us just going, okay, let's tick a box and now we're doing this. It's much more organic, and it allows us to just be in the world together as opposed to experiencing a railroad of a co-op dual experience, if that makes sense.
It demands that our kind of big systems in the game are a lot more real in the sense that we can't really fudge a lot of things. We can't teleport too many things, we can't make too many things uninteractable in the world, because we know that several players will be poking around at everything and they will call out every time something doesn't make sense. And of course, when you have more than one player, you have more than one person who might mess up, right? Get into a fight that they didn't want to, or maybe kill an NPC that they didn't mean to kill. And that kind of brings us to the N+1 design philosophy, where we want to make sure that every situation has different ways to solve it, and then one fallback that is like definitely there, because we know that when more than one person are playing together, they will mess up even like double, triple the
amount of accidental deaths in a co-op experience is just ridiculous.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so you want to put in things like Speak with the Dead that D&D had for years, and now we have it in the game. We know that if you killed a really important NPC, you can still talk to them if you have a scroll of Speak with Dead, right? And if you don't have that scroll, maybe if you're not able to cast that spell, we will put a note somewhere with their diary where they put down the information that you're looking for. And if that doesn't matter, there's probably a solution involving like 100 barrels, right? There's probably that +1 fallback somewhere.
Exactly, yeah. There's always going to be that fallback so that you can feel like no one's invincible or no solution feels, I guess, just gamified, that it feels like, oh, this is locked off because it's a game. You want the world to just feel like it's interactable no matter what the situation.
Yeah, you don't want the game to bottleneck on one specific thing. And co-op kind of keeps us to that standard. It really demands that it's done in every single situation.
And it actually improves the experience as a single player because of the way we build it for co-op.
Yeah, that's a freebie, right? And then in single player, if you don't ever even play co-op, you get a lot of replayability, and you get for free, you get the fact that your stories that you will bring out of Baldur's Gate 3 will not be like stories of other players, and that's a great conversation starter. Like,
absolutely, and that's not even that's from your experience as well, not what's written or anything else like that. So when we go back to Original Sin 1 and Original Sin 2, we had a lot of social experiences, and so much of our game is dialogue driven. DOS 2, it was a big deal that we made it voice acted, because there was so much in there that we wanted, like, it was important that the players felt connected to the story. Now we have cinematic dialogues in BG3, but we've never really breached exactly how far we want to go with social interactivity, right? We've got some dice rolls happening in the background for DOS 2, but now with BG3, we're really leaning heavily on your skills and dice rolls for social interaction. How has that been from a systems point of view? What are you doing to actually really embrace the dice roll in that situation?
Well, that's a system that we added in one of the previous patches as well. We now allow the player to add bonuses as they roll in the dialogue. So this is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, we know that a lot of players will come to Baldur's Gate 3 without in-depth knowledge of D&D. And we want to kind of have a level playing field. We want to make sure that all of them know that there are so many bonuses that they can add. The game is not just demanding, but it also gives you a lot of tools to defeat the RNG, to make sure that the situations go your way. And then the other thing that we really wanted to do is make sure that companions, your party members, whether they're co-op companions or whether they're just AI-driven, they help you in dialogue. So that feels like you're convincing NPCs together. You're getting those skill checks done together. So now it's possible to add bonuses not only from your potion scrolls and spells, but also you can get your companions to try to apply spells to you, or maybe class features that they can apply to you to make sure that you succeed on that really important role.
Which is making our social interactivities even are much more party-based again, which is again different from DOS 2, right? It was a lot more individual back then. Even though you could listen in, you couldn't really interact in any way.
Yeah, in DOS 2, the theme was, if you remember, we had mechanics for players to argue a little bit, to like disagree on how they should proceed. But in BG3, the threat is really external. The party really sticks together a lot, and we want players to feel that commonality, that camaraderie.
And I think one of the other things that have changed a lot since Original Sin 1, Original Sin 2 is even on a very basic level with the engine. The engine has changed and evolved a lot over time, and we're going to be talking about with combat with Edouard. But for you and for your own design and for level design, I'm sure, and you can talk to some of that, I'm sure, verticality is a big deal now, because back then we were dealing with a single plane in our engine. It maybe looked a little bit elevated, but it wasn't really. But now in BG3, we really have full 3D planes that we can have multiple levels on, right? How has that impacted how we design an area or a world or a location?
In DOS 2, indeed, we had a pretty big limitation that we couldn't ever let a character walk on a surface and then have another character walk on a surface above them. Basically, we couldn't have layers or levels. And maybe you didn't notice it when you were playing Divinity Original Sin 2, because our level designers are really good at all of the tricks that make you not notice this. They have all kinds of really interesting things. There was a lot of verticality, and they had things like drawbridges and you know, everything you could do, but at the end of the day, technology was really limiting what we could do, what we could achieve. Yeah. And so with Baldur's Gate 3, finally, we can have really complicated levels that wrap around on themselves. And a really good example is going to be the new area, Grimforge, that we're going to add in patch 6 to Baldur's Gate 3, where we really took advantage of everything that we can do now, create area on top of area on top of area, really like a cake of layers, and then some secret layers on top and on the bottom, and then make sure that, you know, there is always something to jump to or to descend. You have to think in more than 2 dimensions to solve that area.
This blade was a warrior's sacrifice to Illustrae. Blood can only be honored with blood.
All right, so I'm here with Edouard, who is quite a senior designer at this point at Larian. He's been with us since DOS 1. And Edouard, I know you started with combat, but where are you right now when it works on BG3, and what is your job description? What's your role in the company right now?
Yeah, my job description is just senior designer. Like you said, I started in combat, so that was my primary mission on DOS 1 and then DOS 2. But then I gradually inserted myself into anything that is not working the way it should, essentially. I used to be, before being a designer, I was a QA, and so I think I still have a bit of that reflex of chasing issues until they work.
Yeah.
So that is something that I still do. So I'm a general designer, I guess.
You're focusing on combat, but also those specific gameplay scenarios that really feel like they need that extra hands-on extra work. Because our games are very systemic.
Yes.
So sometimes there are certain situations that need that extra little design, extra little effort to put in, and that's where a lot of the time you find yourself, yeah?
Yes, because as a designer, I have to indeed spend time to playing the game, right? And I spot things that could work better, that could be more systemic, that could be used in better ways, different ways to tell more interesting stories. And, you know, that's where I come in.
So, I mean, that leads us on to our next point, because as a gameplay designer, as someone who just kind of inserts themselves in situations that need that extra little touch,
Yeah, indeed.
extra little bit of design. Because of our games being so systemic, a lot of things end up exploding in opportunities, because once we add something, it needs extra, right? So for instance, one of the examples we talked about earlier, which is a clear example of N+1 design really, is actually the torch itself.
Yes.
So we're in a dungeon, we're dungeoneering, we're in 5th edition D&D. I need to have a torch in my inventory, but it's not as simple as that, is it? So when we add a torch in our games, that opens up a wide can of worms. Like what?
Well, first you need to equip the torch. So that takes a slot in your equipment, so that means no more shield. But the fact that you have the torch means that you can fight with it.
Yeah.
You can set stuff on fire with it.
I can hit things.
You can hit things, but it also, if you have a character that doesn't have dark vision, well, you're going to have a disadvantage on attack. Your chance to hit is going to be lower. So you equip the torch and you see better. But if you do need that shield, you can still throw the torch somewhere, creating an aura of light, and then you will want to perhaps put your target in that aura of light so that you see it better. Or perhaps there'll be oil or grease on the floor, and you can throw that torch into that stuff, and it explodes and it catches fire. There's so many things you can do. You can light the torches that are on the walls to light your way, and then at the end you can just pick up the torch, equip it again, and
keep walking. And naturally, as a player, I'm like, well, I have 2 hands. Can I wear 2 torches? And you're like, yeah, well, we have to do that too, right? So even though it doesn't really make mechanical sense,
but I think what really matters when it comes to N+1, right? So N+1 is the systemic solution.
Yes.
So it's not a solution. For instance, if you were to open a door, right? This is the classic example. You need to find the key. But you can just use the systemic solution, which would be to just destroy the door using your weapons, but in a non-combat situation.
Yeah.
And N+1 is a way to use systemic mechanics outside of combat, and that generates stories. That's why it is so fascinating and quite close to the tabletop situations, if we were to discuss that a bit.
Yeah.
Because your players are going to improvise with their equipment, with their weapons, with the stuff you give them, like the torch, and then
or a puzzle like a door, maybe there's a different way around it, right?
precisely, absolutely. And the final thing I want to say is that probably, if you can think about it, you should be able to do it. That's the thing that drives us. Like, okay, I need this hand to hold my shield. If I throw the torch on the floor, will it still work? It should. And so that's where I start chasing people.
Absolutely, right? Because we create all of these systems, but we want that feeling of, as a player, it's a tabletop feel. If I have a torch, I'm going to come up with creative things to do with it. And I know very often it's you, or it's one of our scripters, or it's one of our gameplay guys, or it's Matt in combat.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden they're like, oh, but if we have this, then all of a sudden we have to allow for these situations if players get creative.
The thing that you have is that when the player improvises a situation, basing his reasoning on a system, right, on a systemic mechanic, like it should work. When it does work, the player is so rewarded. You feel smart, you feel good, you're like, wow, this is awesome. This has just generated a story, a moment you will remember. And that's what we want, really.
A lot of the combats are very special for a number of reasons in our games, in my opinion, because of their very handcrafted nature. Now, I know probably originally you may not have been the biggest fan of that. I know that Sven was the big leader of that, right?
Oh yeah. Well, at the beginning, I was working I'm talking early DOS 1, right? I guess I was working the way I was trained, which was to add content, and make it acceptable. But it was unacceptable to Sven, and so there was this philosophy that each fight has to be handmade, handcrafted, and different. I quickly agreed to that. I mean, the friction was very, it was on a short time because
it made sense, right?
Because it made complete sense. Yeah. And to think about it, like if possible, every game should do that. So my point being here, each fight is a puzzle. It's a riddle, right, that you present the player with. And if 2 fights are the same, then your brain goes, yeah, but I've already solved that problem. Yeah. You know what I mean? And so if you are
and you kind of shut off a little bit, don't you? You're not engaged as much as we want you to be engaged.
Indeed, there's that, and also the fact that if you have to rework towards the solution of a problem that you've already figured out, that's work, that's a chore, and we do not want that.
Yeah.
So indeed, we try to make it so that each fight is completely different with a different puzzle element that becomes increasingly complex as you go.
So I know that from the perspective of, even if we're playing we're playing against the same enemy, like if it's two undead enemies and it's a gang of undead enemies on this level and a gang of undead enemies in a different area, that was difficult to say. Both of those fights, though, we're going to make very, very different based on their environments, based on the situation the players find themselves in, deliberately so. But one of the things that I know that we've talked about a lot, we're both DMs.
Yes.
We both approach our DMing and our combat design as that idea of a puzzle to be solved.
Absolutely, yes, that's what it is.
And so that's kind of what you've done here, right? You're always approaching it to be a puzzle to be solved.
Yes, indeed. So when I design for D&D, right, when I'm working on a fight for my players, for the campaign that I'm DMing at the moment, it has to be a puzzle, it has to be interesting, but the puzzle, the mechanics, the solution must be close to the surface, because in D&D, when you die, you're dead. It's over.
Yeah.
So at least up to a certain point, it has to be simple, because you can always miss something, can always go wrong. And if your puzzle is too difficult, if people don't figure it out, they will die and be frustrated and probably hate you forever.
And it's always a delicate balance, because if you make your puzzle too difficult, then they don't feel like they're engaging correctly, or they feel it's their problem. Yes. If it's too easy, it's your problem. So there's a very delicate balance there.
Absolutely true.
It has to be hard, but perhaps the difficulty should be perceived instead of actual difficulty, right? While in Baldur's Gate, the puzzle that we offer can have more layers of complexity, can be more hidden. Perhaps you will require your player to really carefully study the environments. Perhaps there is something in the environment that they can use. Perhaps the players should examine the creature, right-click, examine, oh wow, this guy is vulnerable to fire, for instance, first thing that comes to mind, right? And so you're like, this is already a clear
Those two heads there will instantly go to fire. It's always fire, it's gotta be fire. Yeah.
But you can have Shadow Heart that creates water, so you can put out the fire. I do that all the time, by the way. Anyways, so you guide the player towards solution. Each fight has several solutions. It has to be this way because every party composition is different. Every party build. If you have 4 fighters, nobody can create water. Well, they have scrolls, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, but I was actually it brought up another thought in my head actually, because as DMs and again as you as a combat designer, you would be very often thinking about the tools the players have, right? Absolutely. You know that you've got X fighter, ranger, wizard in your party, and you're like, well, I know that they like to cast this spell or they've got this ability. And in the same way, while it's a little bit more difficult for you, you're always thinking about what interesting puzzles you can make based on the abilities they have and what tools they have at the time, right?
Yes, we have a lot less control in BG3. I was going to say in DOS 1, DOS 2 as well. When you're designing for Dungeons and Dragons, you know your party, you know your friends, you know their classes, you know what they can do. Exactly. So you can work at making everybody happy. Within the puzzle of a fight, there are specific things to do for each class for your friends, so they can feel valued, they can feel, that they're contributing actively. But in Baldur's Gate 3, you don't know what the player is going to show up with. Maybe it's for rangers, maybe it's for wizards. You don't really know. So you have to cater for everybody by making it so that in turns everybody gets to shine. Everybody feels valued at some point. And so it is a lot of parameters to take in and to apply.
Yeah.
But if you're successful, everybody has fun.
And the player feels rewarded when they're using an ability that's theirs, that they chose, right? They feel like they feel like their choice mattered in that moment, which is obviously kind of what you want to do with the power feeling of the game, right?
That is absolutely correct. This is a good, the Create Water is a good example. When everything's on fire because your sorcerer just had a wild magic surge and everything's on fire, well, the cleric can just create water and diffuse the entire situation with one spell. Thank you, cleric. And so that is the kind of stuff that is really wonderful. That generates stories.
Great. Well, then I guess in terms of another element that I know that we've been evolving over time when it comes to Divinity, Original Sin 1, Original Sin 2, and then also BG3, is that our engine has been improving over time. And you've been living with that improvement because as it's mostly impacted combat design. Obviously it impacts level design, and there's some very interesting things we can do with the verticality of BG3. But for you, you've dealt with DOS 1, which is a plain, flat plane.
Yes.
DOS 2, where we had height mechanics, but they were very cheated to a certain degree because it was still one plane, because you couldn't go under everybody.
That's correct, indeed.
And now with BG3, we've got full height verticality, multiple layers. How has that been for you, and how has that changed the way you're making your combats?
All right. So indeed, DOS 2 was 2D. And I'm sorry, DOS 1. DOS 1 was 2D, not DOS 2.
Yeah.
DOS 1 was a flat plane, And so in DOS 2, we, like you said, we introduced the verticality.
And just to expand a little bit, what we mean by flat plane, obviously it's a 3D game, but in terms of the playing, the playing field was basically a 2D playing field. You may as well have been using a D&D battle map.
Absolutely, yes. It was completely. For us, as designers, the battlefield was flat. It would make no difference whether you're standing on a hill or at the bottom of anything, right? And in DOS 2, so we in-house we would call this the vantage point. So you would, with your spellcasting characters or ranged characters, you would try to reach that vantage point. So for instance, you could sneak there, place your guy there before the fight would start, or perhaps you would fight for it, like King of the Hill, a la King of the Hill, right? And that would create a dynamic that would drive the player towards this interesting point. So we would, in terms of indirect control, perhaps we would flash a light on it or make it so that, and it made the battlefield a lot more interesting. We're very happy with that. And now in BG3, now that you can actually go under stuff, we can make the battlefield a lot more complex. So a thing that you can do in BG3 that is, I think, wonderful, is that you can reach this vantage point, this elevated position, and shove people off it. And the AI will do it as well. She will just push you away from it, so you can just fall. You take, fall damage, bludgeoning, and that's what happens. And so this dynamic is even better. And so what we do in BG3, I'll take this even further. We have destructible platforms, which we did not do. We did not do that in DOS 2 at all. And so perhaps sometimes the vantage point will be atop of something that's really fragile. That can one firebolt and the whole thing crumbles and you fall. So yeah, BG3 has driven combat really forward, upwards, I would say. And
look at you! Yeah.
Nice. See what I did there, and I'm very happy with that.
Yeah, because I remember playing DOS 2. You knew height advantage was the most important thing, and you'd go for it. You'd always try and get that spot.
Yes.
But even if the enemy followed you, the AI never really thought about getting you off it. There was never that kind of. They knew that the King of the Hill type thing was there, but they never really figured you shouldn't be here, I should.
Yeah.
While as now with BG3, we've given the tools to allow the AI to really mess with you as well.
So that's correct. I do have things to say about that. That's true. That's 100% true. In DOS 2, the AI would know that it would need to go there, but it would have no non-magical ways to make you go away from it.
Yeah.
The AI, as a ranger or a mage, the AI is programmed to stay away from enemies because it has to be careful, right? Because it's fragile. So when you would occupy a vantage point, the AI would hesitate to actually go be there with you. It would be able to use teleportation, free fall, right? Teleportation, teleport you out of there, or nether swap to swap, spots with you, and that would be great. But in BG3, you can just go up there, make an athletics check, and shove you out of it. And so that is a lot better for us.
Yeah. And I know that we've talked a lot, like as me and you, we talk a lot about combat. I mean, even in our DOS 2 days, I know that one of the things that you like to do, because you're handcrafting all these experiences,
Absolutely.
and you know the players are going to get used to the ebb and flow of how you design your combats. There's a kind of a dance that forms, there's a learned language of that experience. You then play with that to change it on them, right?
Yes. So the idea, I believe that a successful fight, a successful puzzle, right, is that you build expectations, you develop reflexes in your audience.
Yeah.
They will know that they need to look for the light to increase their chance to hit. They know that they will look for the elevated position and so on. And then you turn that around by making it so that perhaps the light is dangerous, it's fire. or perhaps the elevated position is destructible and the AI knows it, things like that. So it's always a twist. So first you have this learning curve where you carefully introduce your mechanics and then you twist it. A thing that we did in DOS 2 that worked very well was that you give the player something so that they build a habit out of using it, then you take it away.
Yeah.
So we have, for instance, some fights where you could not heal. That's the utility spell we take away from you. And so it works very well.
But by doing that, you're also giving us mini objectives throughout the fight, right? Because if I see a height advantage that I know I want, but it's laden with challenges like traps or maybe triggering an extra fight.
Maybe there's a mine up there.
Exactly. I still want it, but now I've got that mini objective that I've got to fight, but I can also maybe get up there if I do X, Y, or Z, right?
Yes, absolutely. You have layers of problems to solve. There's a problem within your problem. And I think that, up to a certain point, if it's always this, it gets annoying, so we have to be careful. But I think that's fun. And I think this ties in nicely with what we were saying before. If a certain class, a certain profile can diffuse this more efficiently than others, then that player will feel validated and they'll be very happy.
Absolutely. And I guess the one last thing that I really want to talk to you, Edward, and it's a big one because, again, as DMs, in fact, I'm dealing with it now. Over the next week or two, I'm going to be running through one of the biggest boss fights of my DM career.
All right.
Boss fights, especially for us, are a big deal, right? Because we try and avoid bullet sponges, or in this case, magic sponges.
Yeah.
We try and avoid lots of resistances as much as we can. We try and give interesting experiences. Tell me about some of the boss fights that you made in DOS 2. I won't say too much about the BG3 ones because we don't want to spoil it for people, but they definitely present a different challenge because a lot of the time you want to bring all the elements that the players have learned into this one experience. So how do you even approach that?
This also ties with what I like as a player. I like to go in with the boss, right? Okay, there's a boss, and your first thought is, I'm gonna die. How even am I gonna kill this thing?
Yeah.
So that is really nice. So first you have to study what's going on. I think that for an efficient boss fight, of course, the puzzle mechanics must be present. I will not talk about that again. We just did.
Yeah.
But phases. So you have to create variation within the fight. So first thing that comes to mind, when the creature hits a certain HP threshold, then the behavior is going to change. A thing that I personally like to do because it ties in with the dramatic aspects of the storytelling. If you have a character that is, for instance, a spellcaster, and you wound it, or you do something to piss him off, he's going to stop magic, just draw a blade, and now he's a melee guy, and you have to deal with that. Yeah. And so these, you have to create variety within a given fight, so that it is never like a bullet sponge, like you said, and not just damage, and oh my god, finally it's dead, because that is a chore, that is work. Yeah. And we do not want that. We want the player to be able to to think about what they're doing and to be able, we are giving them the ability to improvise, adapt. There's a meme like this, improvise, adapt, overcome, doesn't matter. My point being, we need to create variation within the fight. And also
create layers to it, right?
Indeed. And the final thing that I want to say is that personally, what I really like is that when I show up at a boss, right? I'm like, oh my god, I'm going to die. I actually managed to down it on the first try. But when I do this, I had to improvise and I had to be smart and find the right solutions to do that. Maybe half of my party is dead, I'm out of spell slots, I drank all my potions, but I did it, it is dead, and I did it on the first go. It was hard, but I was allowed to be smart and to solve the issue myself. And that is a very delicate balance of having to expose your puzzle mechanics just enough so that people are being guided towards a solution and feel really good about having solved that particular problem.
Tissue markings. Could this be? Magical energy courses through the slate, then to Lae'zel. Your own body buzzes in resonance.
Thanks very much for watching. Thanks very much from Jason, Nick, and Edward. Thank you. I really hope you learned a lot from how we make our games, how you get that tabletop feel across in both DOS 2, DOS 1, and BG3. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.